Hi, I'm Father Michael Barrett at Saint Agnes Church. Today we're going to talk about funerals. We're in a society, as we know, that avoids talk about death, especially our own death. And at the same time, we should think about those who will plan our death when the day comes. A funeral plan that will make lives more simple, their lives, preparing well, and give the people around them consolation. Hopefully consolation at the point of our death. Sometimes the best thing is to make a list of instructions of our funeral and what is going to be done with our bodily remains when we're deceased. And we have to let people know that those instructions exist. We can't put the instructions in the last will and testament because that's way too late before that's looked at. So it has to be a set of instructions somewhere in our home that the people closest to us, more than one perhaps, knows that they exist. And then later on, maybe some of us are more comfortable at a funeral home. There are programs where you can go to a funeral home long before you die and explain that, when you're preparing for death, this is the way you want your funeral to be. And they can understand and work with you to plan your own funeral so that at the time you die, your family can take care of everything through that funeral home. Again, though, you have to let people know that that's the funeral home that is going to take care of it, not some other funeral home that they may go out and contract, especially if you have already paid that funeral home for at least part or all of your funeral expenses. A person may go to a funeral home and ask them for help because they have tremendous experience in how to do these things. One of the things I'm reading here is the general introduction to the funeral mass, which, someday you can read if you're planning a funeral, or you don't have to, but somebody will read it for you. And it says, in the face of death, the church confidently proclaims that God has created each person for eternal life, and that Jesus, the Son of God, by his death and resurrection, has broken the chains of sin and death that bound humanity. Christ achieved his task of redeeming humanity and giving perfect glory to God, principally by the paschal mystery of the Blessed Passion, resurrection from the dead, and glorious ascension. So that gives us a background of what we're talking about as we prepare for the funeral. One of the things, of course, is the liturgy surrounding the funeral. Some people don't want to have any kind of liturgy at all. I think most good Catholic people want some liturgy. And I think what we have to realize is the best liturgy is the holy sacrifice of the Mass. There are times when people will say, well, I just want a memorial service at the funeral home, or I just want a memorial service at the church without the Mass. I think most people would rather have, as is usual, the full Mass, the holy sacrifice of the Mass, celebrated by a priest or a bishop for the death of the person. I think it's important because sometimes younger people don't realize how older people have such a commitment to the Holy Eucharist, to the Mass. And we can overlook it because of our own, you might say, being a little bit away from the activities of the church, but they have to come back to it at the moment of the person's death. This is another part. It says that the death of a Christian whose life of faith was begun in the waters of baptism and strengthened at the Eucharistic table, the Church intercedes on behalf of the deceased because of its confident belief that death is not the end, nor does it break the bonds forged in life. The Church also ministers to the sorrowing and consoles them in the funeral rites with the comforting word of God and the sacrament of the Eucharist. I think it's a great thing. Sometimes if we do have the opportunity to go to a funeral, and I put this in as an aside, people who don't go to Mass regularly, maybe it's time for them to think about returning. Probably they should go to the sacrament of reconciliation and prepare their soul, and then at the funeral Mass to receive the Eucharist for their own consolation, but also as something that that person who's passed away moves them to do. It helps them to get closer to the church. So the a little bit later, it points out this idea that at the funeral rites, especially the celebration of the Eucharistic sacrifice, the Christian community affirms and expresses the union of the church on earth with the church in heaven in the one great communion of the saints. So the Catholic Church exists in both places. It's not just something on this earth. It's not just an institution. It's something that Jesus Christ personally founded and then made Peter the one that would be his vicar, the one who would take his place when he ascended into heaven. So the church is a big part of our life. Besides the vigil service, we have the communion service, the Eucharist. We have the vigil service, which is also called a wake. The wake is another great opportunity for people to get closer to God. It's different in different cultures. I grew up in an Irish household. One of the things about a wake is the funeral home usually had to have a bar across the street. If it didn't have a bar, there was a little bit of nervousness about the people have no place to go for a drink over the course of the night. When I grew up, it was 3 nights of the wake. Nowadays, it's usually 1, maybe 2. My brother died. He was a priest in New York City, and he was waked in the chapel of the seminary, St. Joseph's in Dunwoody, not too long before Pope St. John Paul II had met with seminarians all up and down the East Coast in that chapel. It was beautiful. The place was big. And when I first went into the wake, the place was packed. The head of the seminary was, the rector was now Cardinal Ed O'Brien. And at one point, all of my family came to me, the men principally, and they said, there's no bar across the street from the seminary. So I told them that we had to find a place where people could gather in smaller groups and have a drink. Ed O'Brien, being O'Brien, said, I wasn't sure what kind of Irish you are, but now I know. We'll have it fixed in 5 minutes. And we did. That's part of I know it sounds funny, but that's part of the people on earth, the church on earth, living what they live as well as being united to the church in heaven. So the vigil service is a great time. And I think it brings the family together. It's a wonderful reason when we all see each other. And yeah, we come together to lament the loss of one of us, and sometimes it's hard because the person may have been young. In my brother's case, he was 42. A person who's young, or maybe a person who's very old, who's been with us for a long time and becomes the center of our life in a certain way, or at least part of our lives. The times when you don't have the wake or the vigil service in the evenings before, you can usually do it at the funeral home the morning of the funeral. I say that because sometimes people's schedules are so demanding that you can go to the funeral home and spend a few minutes, an hour maybe, in front of the body, and then at 10 or 11 o'clock they bring the body to the church for the celebration of the Eucharist. It's a great opportunity not just to go to the liturgy, but also to spend time with the person who's deceased and to visit the family and spend time with them, comfort them. You know, when somebody dies, in a way, even though we know it's not the end, as I just read, it is a break. It is a tough thing to see someone that we love disappear, no longer there. And I think the people in the family need the rest of the people in the church, family, friends, to come and support them. They need that support. Maybe you don't care, but they need it. And so you have to go for them. Some other idea here that comes from the general introduction of the funeral mass. It says here, in planning and carrying out the funeral rites, the pastor and all the other ministers should keep in mind the life of the deceased and the circumstances of death. They should also take into consideration the spiritual and psychological needs of the family and friends of the deceased to express grief and their sense of loss, to accept the reality of death, and to comfort one another. Maybe that's why we have to have a bar across the street at an Irish wake. What do we do with the bodily remains of the person who is deceased? Now, this is a big, big question nowadays, since everybody has gone towards cremation. Cremation means to burn the body up. And I'll put it up here because I think we have to understand why the church did not support it for so many years, and now the church accepts it. The church did not support it because cremation meant we didn't care about the body, and almost it was a reaction against the notion of the resurrection of the body. As time has changed, that's not so much the case. So now the church says, if you don't fall into that trap of using cremation as sort of a rebelliousness against the church, it's fine to do. And in fact, you can bring the cremated remains to the church instead of the body for the funeral. And at the time that comes, I'll explain to you how to do that. But in the remains of a person who's cremated, what do we do with it? What do we do with the ashes? Very important, because a lot of people don't understand that the ashes, like a body, should be buried. Where can we bury the ashes? We can bury the ashes in a cemetery, just like we do with the body. One of the good things about a cemetery is in a grave site, you put one body. But if you have ashes in a grave site for one body, you can put two sets of ashes, which sometimes is kind of important because of how much it costs to buy a grave site. The other thing is a columbarium, kind of a fancy word, which is a little bit like the mausoleum. Mausoleum is the buildings you see in the cemetery. Inside the building are niches in the walls, and in those niches are the bodies. Well, the columbarium is the same kind of setup, but in the walls are spaces for urns, not for bodies, but just for urns, for the ashes. If you go to St. Peter's Basilica and you go under the basilica and visit the cemetery, you can see where the Roman families became Catholic, because in the early parts of the mausoleums under St. Peter's, it's all urns, because that's what they did. They buried the ashes in those urns in the columbarium. But after a while, you'll see in some tombs, they open up big spots for full bodies, because that meant they became Christian. Because the notion of Christianity is the body will rise from the dead. Now, obviously, God knows how to do that, whether it's ashes or not ashes. But in a certain sense, even the Jewish people understand that their whole body should be buried together. Very important idea. But in the Catholic tradition, we do accept that cremation is fine as long as you understand that God will raise that body up from the grave. So, why do we like cremation? Well, it's less expensive in the cemetery or the columbarium. When we do the funeral, we don't buy a coffin, which might cost $6,000 to $10,000. You rent it if you're going to have a wake. And then when it's over, you give the coffin back, and then you bury the remains of the person who's deceased. So that's part of the reason why people lean in that direction. And I understand that because, frankly, sometimes a funeral is a very expensive proposition. And that's why some people start paying for it by going to a funeral home even a few years before their death, to take the burden off the family when the time comes. Because it can easily cost $10,000 to $15,000 at times for a funeral with all of the details that you might want. In Texas, sometimes you'd find the ashes, not in the cemetery, the columbarium, but you'd find them in ceramic boots on the fireplaces in Texas ranches, or you find it in an urn somewhere in the family room. People kept the ashes in their house. Not a good idea. I mean, apart from the notion of carrying the ashes around in the house, it's not really a great idea. They should be buried. They have a place that we can go and pray for them, a place where we can, in a sense, reconnect with them. How many movies have you seen where the people go back to the gravesite to speak to the one that died with great power of talking to that person, a spouse or a parent. In a way, we all need that on earth. We need to have that opportunity. So that's why it's good to bury the ashes as a place where we can go and pray for them. When we make plans for the funeral, we have to think about not just sort of a big issue, but we might want to spend a little more time. Maybe we'll leave it up to the people who prepare, but maybe we want to think about the music, the hymns that we might use, for example, or some other music that's going to be used. We might want to think about the readings, what readings we would like to have read at our funeral. There's various opportunities, and then maybe who are the lectors in reading those readings. We might even need to ask a particular priest that we love to do the funeral for us, or a bishop. And maybe it's a friend in the family, maybe it's a relative, maybe it's someone we've been in the parish with for a long time and we've become very close to, and we just say, we'd like you, if you could, please do the funeral when I die. And I think that's a great thing. So we all suffer when one of us dies, and those of us still alive have to help one another through the funeral arrangements. The whole process of planning a funeral, on the one hand, it can seem a burden, and it is to some extent, but on the other hand, it's a great opportunity to go back to deeper things that we often forget about on a day-to-day basis. It's an opportunity for us to go back to what's really happening to this brother, sister, parent, child, friend of mine right now who's gone, but he's not gone. So we need that time, and we need to go through those steps. And in a way, they're a form of grieving. I think many people today do not know how to grieve at the death of a person who dies. It takes a little bit of thought, but people have to learn how to grieve. And the funeral, preparing for it, the wake and so on, is all part of that grieving process, which frankly, psychologically, is really, really good. So put this together and realize that the most important thing is a wonderful funeral for all of us and the person who dies, to make sure that the person is buried somewhere that we can go and find him, whether it's his ashes or his body, or maybe it's his body after the body has gone for scientific research. Usually you may give it up for scientific research. They use it for a while, and after a year they may give it back to you. But again, what's used goes into the ground. There's a place for it. So all the time we're thinking of having the child, having the person somewhere near to us. Remember these things, and if you have any questions, you can always call your local pastor, and I'm sure he can help you to find a way to get the advice you want even ahead of time before the funeral actually takes place. Thank you very much, and God bless.